Ladies and gentlemen, I know that our next two guests also don't need any introduction, but if I may just do the formalities. On my farthest right, Runa, who is the co-founder and now managing director as well of Development Partners International. DPI, as it's fondly known in this room, is the largest African private equity fund. And Runa, it has been running for nearly 20 years now. Oh, there we go, 25 years, sorry, my facts were incorrect, or my maths was incorrect. 25 years, and nobody has done more on the African continent in terms of investing and impact investing than the DPI team. On my close right is Cherie Blair. Again, Cherie, thank you very much for joining us today. I first met Cherie back in 2017. I was reminding her back at an event with Safaricom, which was in Nairobi. And then again, we met at UNGA in New York in 2022. And wherever there's an Africa-focused conversation, I find that Cherie is there. Her interest and passion in the continent is really well known, and we're delighted to have both of you here with us this afternoon. So without further ado, I hand you over, Runa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. So in this session, we'll start a conversation about investing in Africa, issues of enabling environment, bringing women into the workforce, some conversation on ESG and climate change. Cherie, you and I are interested in all of that, and we've devoted many years, decades in fact, doing that, but coming from very different work areas. So I'm in the private sector, that's all I've ever done, and you've done many things, very successful career. You have a law practice, Omnia, you have the Cherie Blair Foundation, and you've been interested in issues of social justice, climate change, conflict mitigation, but also very much helping women entrepreneurs. Could you tell us why you started doing this? What is your interest in Africa? And what are some of the things that you're doing now?
Well, you know, the strange thing is that Africa has always been a part of my life. And that's because when I was growing up in Liverpool, my grandfather was a merchant seaman, and I lived with my grandparents, and his ship that he was on then was part of the Elder Dempster Line, and they went from Liverpool down the coast to Spain, crossed the Bay of Biscay, and stopped at the various ports in West Africa and ended up in Lagos. So Africa was always quite a real place to me, and that interest developed as I grew older, and in the 70s I read law, I got involved in the anti-apartheid movement. I met my husband, who has his own family connections with Africa. Through the church, we got involved with the debt relief movement, and obviously made many African friends as a result of that, some of whom, like the president of South Africa, you know, we've known for many, many years. And then, of course, in the way these things happen, my husband becomes prime minister. And I think from the very beginning, it was always very clear that Africa was important to him and therefore to the British government. And through that and through the Commonwealth, again, so many great relationships. And I'm thinking back, and I know His Excellency, the High Commissioner for Rwanda is here. It was 2005 that I first went to Rwanda. And, you know, a relationship that's been very long-standing, and to see the progress, for example, that Rwanda has made since I first went in 2005 is amazing. That the vibrancy, the opportunities, the young countries that are Africa, it's just such an exciting place to work in. So when we left Downing Street, it made sense to me, but whatever I wanted to do in the future, Africa had to be a part of that. And that started in 2008 with my Women's Foundation, where we, since then, we've reached 250,000 women in over 100 countries, but many of those countries, the countries we started in are in Africa. We work with women entrepreneurs to help them set up, sustain, and grow their businesses, not just so that they can feed themselves and their children, but because we believe that women are the drivers of development, that women can achieve right up to the highest levels and grow big businesses and become real leaders in their community. So that was how we started. And then it was inspired by those women that I would see, and I'd see the challenges that they overcame. And so in 2012, when the opportunity arose, I thought to myself, Cherie, it's about time you followed the example of these amazing women. And so then with Julia, who's here with me today, my co-founder of Omnia Strategy, we, 3 women, as we were then, decided we were going to take on this rather male-dominated world of investment trade disputes and business and human rights. And we set up Omnia Strategy, and again, many of our clients are either investing in Africa or African governments, and we absolutely have been on an incredible journey with them. So Africa is very much at the heart of what we do.
Absolutely, and I came at it completely differently. I came at it as a development economist who thought there's $300 trillion of private wealth in the world. How can we get it into developing markets, particularly Africa? And the private equity model was a good model. It's the model that the development institutions brought in 25 years ago to put money into Africa, to create more companies, create jobs, and also over the years really also focus on some of the important things like bringing women in, as you were talking about, climate change, creating jobs, financial inclusion. But sticking to the topic of women, we know that 51% of the world are women, 51% of Africa. When you have a continent which is young, which has so many opportunities, but also needs to bring in all the skill sets, we need women in the room. And with where I've really focused on is the 2X Collaborative, which is an OECD initiative to make sure our industry, which has very few women in it, has more women. We are 50-50 men and women in my company, but also to make our companies gender balanced. So talk to us about how to bring in women. You work with entrepreneurs and women. How do you create more women entrepreneurs? What are some of the obstacles? Just tell us a little more about that.
Well, first of all, we have to realize that there's nowhere in the world where women have equal opportunities, equal justice with men. There just isn't. Some countries are doing better than others. Rwanda, by the way, is also one of them. And some other the Scandinavian countries. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the waste of talent that is going on in our world today because we are not providing equal opportunities to 51% of the population, and when one sees the trillions of dollars that could be added to the world's GDP if we only enabled those women to take their full part, those women and girls, then you can see that it's a bit like Hillary Clinton once described it as flying a twin-engined aeroplane with one of the engines switched off. You might get to your destination, but you're going to get there a lot slower without ensuring you've got that double power. So this is vital. But what are the obstacles for women? Well, some of them are legal. There are so many countries in the world that actually have positive obstacles to women participating in the workforce. They certainly have many, many obstacles to women actually owning the wealth that they are producing. Well, we mentioned agriculture earlier. The vast majority of agricultural workers in work is actually done by women. But how much of the agricultural wealth is in their hands? A tiny, tiny percentage. And part of that is to do with unequal laws and inheritance and in land ownership. On top of that, as we find whenever we talk to the women we work with, there is this deep-seated assumptions, stereotypes about what women can and cannot do. My foundation, one of the things we do is produce research about the obstacles for women entrepreneurs. And 2 years ago, we produced an International Women's Day research about sex stereotypes. This year, we produced a report about the obstacles that women face in gaining access to technology. And these deep-seated assumptions come in various ways. One of the women we surveyed this year, who is the CEO of her business, told us how when she goes to meetings, she'll always go with her male driver, but she will often bring him into the room with her because the men that she's working with will assume that he is the owner of the business, and she introduces herself not as a CEO, but as the marketing officer, because that's the way she can get business. How many men could tell you that story? How many men have to pretend to be women to get work? No, it doesn't work that way. Or another one of the women we spoke to from Kenya told us she's in agriculture and she did a lot of her business online. And then when she went to meet one of her main clients in person, when he discovered she was a woman, he said, but women don't do agriculture. Again, complete myth. Or the women, like the women in Nigeria, who, when we were doing our survey this year about how you impacted by technology, said that every day in her clothing business online, every day, she will encounter some kind of sexist comment, threats of violence. The research we did showed that 2/3 of the women that we surveyed who work with us in our programs had experienced gender-based violence online in their business sites, not in their personal sites, in their business sites. And of them, 9%, nearly 10% of them said it actually had adversely affected their ability to do business. So this question of how we think of women, the assumptions that are made, and what about women, affects women in so many ways. It affects them in their access to finance. How often? Well, you know.
I absolutely do.
In the venture capital world, for example, these are supposed to be the cleverest investors in the world. How much of that investment goes into women-led businesses? The answer, my darling, is 2%. Now, I can assure you that 2% is an accounting error. It is not a business strategy. In other words, men in this business are just investing in people who look and talk like them. And it's a very short-sighted approach, because we all know, don't we, that it's diverse businesses with different mindsets and cooperating together that makes the most productive
Absolutely.
businesses.
So, Cherie, I have to say I'm old enough to have had a similar experience, not with a driver, but a junior person in my team, where everything was addressed to him. So it wasn't that many years ago, frankly. So, but
Absolutely. When I started my legal practice, I can assure you the number of people who thought I was the secretary, not actually the lawyer, and then would kind of sort of panic when they realized it was me who was going to represent them is
but I will
quite
say,
astonishing.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say, especially to this audience, that those of us who are investing do have a bit of power, right? So you can invest in companies like we do that have program for women entrepreneurs. We have a company called Kafina, which has a program called Finel, which actually provides loans, now more digitized, to women entrepreneurs. We can also make sure that when we invest, and this is part of the 2X criteria, we put board members on the companies who are women. We put them in senior management roles. We try to make sure that we hire and retain women so we can get to a higher percentage of women employees. So we do have the ability to do that. I want to shift now to the Lexus of women and climate change. So,
before we do, I just wanted to say something, because it came up and we looked at each other in the last panel. And Idris said, didn't he, that capital is cowardly. And I just wanted to say, as I said to you, you prove that actually female capital is not cowardly at all.
I'm still here after 25 years. Thank you, Cherie. I have to call out so many women in Africa that I work with or have worked with who definitely are not cowards in investing and taking the first risk, whether it's venture capital. Our head of venture capital is a woman, or it's private equity. So thank you for that, and I totally agree with you. There is a nexus between women and climate change, from the area that it's girls and women who get water, and if the water is further away, huge
the girls don't
part
go
of
to school.
Absolutely, they don't go to school. Next generation is hurt, all the skill sets. The productivity during the day goes down, all the way to a lot of research now that women are some of the biggest allies, especially in Africa, to anything having to do with climate change mitigation. So in our work, every company we work with, we look at the greenhouse gas emissions. We try to measure, reduce carbon footprint, and put in renewables. That is at that level. But you're also very much interested in this. Women and climate change, or climate change yourself. Tell us your thoughts on that.
Well, let me first of all say, and I think there's a real opportunity here for Africa. I agree with what Idris said. In the introduction, Safaricom was mentioned. There is an opportunity here for Africa because they aren't burdened, if you like, with the old infrastructure. And you saw that so clearly in mobile banking that came out of the late, great Bob Collymore and what he did with Safaricom, because there was no way you were ever going to get traditional banking opening in the villages and the remote areas around Kenya. But the mobile phone provided an opportunity that women in particular seized to be able not only to do business transactions, but also to gain control over that money, because there's still too many women who make money and then their husbands take it and spend it on things that are not necessarily what they should be spending it on. So Africa has an opportunity in relation to climate change to leapfrog and experiment with actually doing it better. But I also want to sound a note of caution because, as I know, because we work with many African governments, we do disputes in relation to the lack of electricity generation in Africa, that climate-provided electricity is climate dependent. And so that means absolutely you have amazing hydroelectric potential in, for example, Zambia, but a third of the year there's drought. You can't therefore produce electricity. Similarly, perhaps less so with the sun, but nevertheless, there are times when you're not going to be able to do that. And that means there still has to be, and I again agree with Idris, you cannot turn around here in Western Europe when we have created the climate change problem and say to Africa, well, I'm very sorry, but you can't use your raw materials, your gas and your oil and your coal to provide electricity for your people. But it is an opportunity for Africa to be able to take the lead in how you do invest in those industries in a way that does less damage to the climate and then mitigate
Absolutely.
that as well. And this is another opportunity where there are this huge potential in Africa.
Yes, and actually, if you look at the actual facts, many countries in Africa have huge resources in hydro and in wind, and they're further ahead in renewables than some of the countries in the West. So it is absolutely there. Again, you touched on digitalization, and that is something that we are really working on in all of our companies, both on the private equity side and the venture capital side. You mentioned the leapfrogging and the legacy. Well, if people don't have bank accounts and they don't have a credit card. Through digitization, you can get to, the unbanked. Your phone is your credit card, your phone is your mobile wallet, and that makes a huge difference.
Digital identity
Absolutely.
is so important to governments. My husband, with his institute, is working with many African countries at the moment, working on using digital identity to enable government to deliver services to its people, to get data from its people, to be able to actually, again, leapfrog the existing systems, the old systems that we have here in Western Europe and America. So digitalization is key. And I think, for example, we talk about broadband, and that is important. But, for some countries, maybe the answer isn't setting up traditional telecommunications. It's thinking about satellite.
Absolutely.
And thinking about using satellite, which then you don't require digging up anything, and then you can actually reach the remotest parts of the country, because Africa absolutely needs infrastructure development. Infrastructure, whether it's electricity, whether it's the other kind of infrastructure, and that's governance. And we haven't even touched on that, but we have to recognize that one of the difficulties to get people to invest in Africa is concerns about governance in Africa. And I would regard that as the sort of other kind of infrastructure that we absolutely need to work on. We're privileged in the work that we do to be able to help and work with governments to help advise them on the best kind of legal framework for the ability for the people who want to invest in the country to do business. But it's not enough to provide legal structures that are for foreign investors. We absolutely have to ensure that those structures also work for the entire people. And that's why the other big part of our practice in Omnia is what we call our business and human rights ESG practice, to ensure that those who come into a country to work alongside the people of that country to develop their wealth do so in a way that recognizes the social, the environmental, and the governance obligations that they owe to the people of that country.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree with you more. I started out my journey, Cherie, thinking that the private sector is very important. 25 years ago, there were countries in Africa that had more in the public sector, GDP in the public sector, than the private sector. And that has grown over the years tremendously, the private sector part of the GDP. But over the years, I've also realized to be an investor and to bring in more money, you have to have the proper governance. So you're absolutely right. We have to be partners in this, and so it's extremely important to do that. Having said that, what do you think creates an enabling environment? So this is an old word, we've been talking about this for decades, but I feel that in the recent 5 years or so, there was COVID, there's also other things, we haven't said that word enough. There needs to be consistency in that. Any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I do think technology is an opportunity.
Yeah.
It's very hard to bribe a computer. And that's why we're very keen on how do we provide digitalization of services. Now, obviously, that requires electricity and everything else, but when you've got digitalized services, then the money actually goes to the people it should be going to, and there's much less opportunity for that money to drop off along the value chain, which certainly it has done in the past. And I'm a lawyer. The rule of law is so important. And the ability not only to have lawyers and judges who deliver corruption-free justice, but also we have to make sure we're delivering speedy justice. And one of the problems I think we do have in Africa today is the long delays in the system, which mean that people are not getting the speedy answers to their problems that they require. It's why, of course, we have so many of the investment tribunals that I'm appearing, in one next week in relation to that, why people are opting out of the domestic legal systems into these other systems. But in those systems too, it's equally important that the investor needs to have its rights protected, but there has to be room for the governments to be able to change the laws, to introduce new requirements in order to protect our environment and the social needs of the people.
Absolutely. So I am an optimist. You have to be an optimist if you've been investing for so long and you've actually made returns. You brought in more money in Africa. It has worked. So I think there's tremendous potential in Africa, and there's more than potential. There's real companies doing very well. And all the topics we talked about, there's been tremendous progress and tremendous potential. A last word on the future, and then we'll finish up.
The best thing about Africa is the African people, and particularly, of course, that huge resource, which is the young people. Africa is going to produce so many young, talented people who are eager to get ahead. And by harnessing their talents and providing the enabling environment to allow them to flourish, there's no stopping this continent.
Thank you very much.